Okay. This evening, I take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Aaron Watson, who is an independent researcher, visual creator, and founder of the heritage consultancy Monumental. From 2019 until August 2024, Aaron worked for Kilmartin Museum as part of our curatorial and interpretation team, developing storylines and imagery for the museum's redeveloped exhibition. He continues to contribute to the museum's activities, publications, and research, drawing upon over 20 years of experience as an archaeologist, photographer, and filmmaker. Aaron's talk this evening is titled Investigating Rock Art in Kilmartin Glen, Experiences and Excavations. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Aaron.
Right, good evening. And this is where Aaron tries to work out how to share his screen. Right, help me out, Jacqueline. Are you seeing the slide? I saw your lips move.
Yes.
I think we're good. I think we're good to go.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, good evening. Thanks again, Jacqueline, for that introduction and for the invitation to talk this evening. And thanks for everyone for joining me. And hello. I'm going to be talking about Kilmartin Glen. And there we go. There's a view of Kilmartin Glen, which is, as I'm sure you know, the focus for a remarkable concentration of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments, which date to approximately between 3.5 to around about 6,000 years ago. Within just a few kilometers of the museum where Jacqueline is sitting right now, is a massive timber cursus. There are chambered cairns. There are circles of timber, circles of stone, a linear cemetery of funerary cairns, Scotland's largest timber circle, in fact, and numerous standing stones. And of course, there's the focus this evening, which is numerous rock carvings, including some of the largest and most elaborate found anywhere. If you'd like an introduction to rock art, I did a talk for the museum a few years ago. I can't sure if I can remember the title, but if you go and have a look at that, maybe when I finished this evening, another time, go and have a look at that talk. And that gives quite a detailed introduction to rock art and sort of the ideas about what it is. It describes it, talks about its chronology in a little bit more detail than I will this evening. Tonight, I'd like to focus a little bit more on certain kinds of interpretive approaches to rock art, rather than just describing what it is. And I'm going to start by thinking about that it's not just the number of sites that's significant. It's their context in Kilmartin Glen, which, and you might not be able to read the writing on the little arrows, but one of the things that I think makes Kilmartin interesting is how such contrasting and various traditions of architecture in the form of those monuments, but also artifacts and the materials used to make those artifacts were brought together in this place. It doesn't matter what the detail is, it's just the number of arrows and where they come from, but they include things like flint from Ireland or grooved ware, which probably has its origins in Orkney, beakers perhaps from the continent, materials and artifacts from Yorkshire, passage tomb art from Ireland. That's just a few examples of the prehistoric themes that converge in this landscape. And specifically with rock art, I formulated this diagram to try and describe a really interesting kind of pattern, if you like. And that is that Kilmartin Glen, believe it or not, is the only place in Britain and Ireland where the three main styles, some people might say traditions of rock art, come together. And again, I introduced those in my previous evening talk from a few years ago. But just to summarize them now, those three styles that I'm focusing on are Atlantic rock art, which is the cup and ring marks that we're possibly most familiar with. Then there's also what I would call megalithic art, which is a kind of the kinds of images that would be more often associated with architecture, most specifically in Ireland, in North Wales, and in Orkney, spirals, that kind of thing. And the third style of art is what I've just lumped together as figurative. And that includes the, really amazing, almost unique carvings of metalwork and the unique carving of deer and perhaps other animals at Duncragg. And together they coalesce here in Kilmartin Glen. And together with those other factors from the previous slide, this constantly raises a question in my mind and in other people's minds. And that question has to be, why did Kilmartin Glen become such a special place in prehistory? And that's kind of what I'm going to have a go at thinking about this evening through the lens of rock art, through the lens of landscape research, and through the lens of excavation in the area. But I'm going to start with a few sort of foundational ideas, if you like. One of those is very practical. It's the abundance of materials in the glen, for example, for building megalithic structures. It's a good example here where you've got effectively a standing stone, which is through the actions of time has almost sort of moved out from an outcrop. You see this all over the landscape here, where big splinters of stone start to shear away. They make great standing stones. And likewise, the glaciated metabasite geology, the bedrock, including mica schists and epidierite, presents these amazing outcrops, which make the glen really suitable as a focus for making rock art. Another very broad theme that I'll just throw in is that I think the region is arguably very attractive for settlement in prehistory, particularly for the west coast of Scotland. It's relatively low-lying. It's this relatively being the optimal word here, relatively low-lying, relatively sheltered. And there's quite a diversity of different terrestrial and marine environments and resources, of course. And given those factors, it's no surprise, perhaps, that there's very early evidence for cereal cultivation in Kilmickle Glen, which is just over the hill from Kilmartin, where barley and wheat were being grown around 3400 BC, give or take, which is some of the earliest dates anywhere for that kind of thing, in Scotland in particular. Another factor, which I've just illustrated with a simple map, the square kind of showing kind of roughly where the Glen is its geographical location. It's obviously broadly on the Atlantic coast, albeit with an archipelago of the Inner Hebrides gathered around, the Mull of Kintyre down to the south. But there's a number of different seaways that link with Ireland, with other parts of mainland Scotland. Ultimately, of course, the further flung locations, whether Orkney in Scotland and the north coast, or down towards the borders and into England. And I think coastal travel and sea travel was something that's often underestimated when we're thinking about the significance of places in prehistory. And just to really emphasize that point, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, I'm going to just very quickly give an overview of a recent analysis by Fraser Sturt at Southampton University, who's produced a paleo-environmental reconstruction of sea level for Kilmartin's coastline for 3000 BC. So that's pretty much spot on when the core late Neolithic monuments are being constructed, the heyday of Neolithic Kilmartin, I suppose we could say. And I've sort of simplified this bathymetric data down to a simple map. This is the core area of the Glen. Several of the most famous sites are labelled. Now, that's where the coastline is at the present, round about Crinan Harbour. And when I press a button now, that is the sea level for 3000 BC. And I think what's so fascinating about this is it makes the locations of some of these monuments make a great deal more sense. I'll just pop back. There we go. There's the present day. Look where the sites are, rock art, Temple Woodstone Circle. And then when we reintroduce the sea level, at about the time when these sites were either being made or used, we can see that there's a very interesting correlation. What's now a very large basin, the Moyne Vor, was effectively an inshore lagoon at the end of the Neolithic. And that's a sheltered haven, really, where small craft could land in comparative safety. And the intertidal areas of that lagoon, which are the lighter shade of blue, so that's where the tidal range would be, rather than there being water all of the time, seems to have been of some special significance, given that a lot of those monuments are gathered right on towards the high tide line. And they include some of the region's largest, in fact, almost most of the region's largest and most complex rock art sites. And no surprise, I think, with this one, this takes me to Achnabrec. I've just labeled it there. And look where Achnabrec is in relation to this projected sea line, sea level for the Neolithic. There it is in the present day, no sea. It's a bit marshy, but there's no sea. In the Neolithic, this site, there we go, Achnabrec, would be overlooking in a tidal area in the valley down below, which would have effectively be an extension of Loch Gilp as it is today. Achnabrec has other significances in relation to the sea, because it also overlooks the shortest overland connection between the inland waters, if you like, of the Clyde and the Atlantic to the west. And that routeway, of course, is now occupied for very specific reasons by the Crinan Canal, avoiding, as it does, a dangerous sea crossing around the Mull of Kintyre. So that's a very interesting point about these sites. Achnabrec itself has a diverse range of cup and ring markings, and some of those are more typical of the Atlantic rock art style, the cups and the rings and the grooves, which dominate the image that you see now. But they are on parts of this rock juxtaposed against rarer motifs, including this horned spiral, which is very much more unusual. Very general point to make, and it introduces rock art more generally in many ways, is the interaction between these carvings and natural features, geological features on the surface of the rock. And they're the sort of linear grooves and cracks that you can see in this image, which are linking into the artificially created design of the circles with some radial grooves. But you can see how those rings join on one side with those natural features on the rock's surface. And the rock art is generally distributed along the spine of what is essentially an enormous domed outcrop, which is oriented in the direction that this photograph is taken, towards the southwest. And this combination of natural and cultural elements, and this is a theme I'm going to return to a few times this evening, but this composition of natural and cultural elements frames and aligns upon the setting sun at the winter solstice. And that setting sun optimally illuminates a panel which contains most of the most unusual and rare designs, including those horned spirals, like the example in the foreground. Aknabrek's a very good introduction to the wider area in some ways, because that sort of southwest axis or northeast southwest axis is actually a fundamental property of the wider geology of the area. And if you climb up onto the hills and you look out, for example, here across some of the islands just off the coastline, you can see how they're all arranged in lines. And those lines with the sea dividing them are also in that northeast southwest axis. So quite fortuitously, the lochs, islands, hills, glens, peninsulas, the grain of the topography, if you like, encapsulates and frames the seasonal movements of the sun. And I think that's most obvious in many ways during the winter months. And this is just one example where I've stood, in this case, just to one side of the glebe cairn, and that's the big mound in front of the of where I'm holding the camera. And I've stood there through an entire day, and every, I don't know, hour and a half in the winter time. This is a midwinter image. You can probably tell by the vegetation. I've taken a photograph of where the sun is in the sky, and then I've combined them together, and that shows how the sides of the glen, the hills that create the upper part of Kilmartin Glen, frame the movements of the winter sun from dawn until dusk. And I think that this correlation between the land and the sun must have been auspicious for prehistoric communities for whom turning points of the year, in particular the transition at winter time back into longer light, warmer weather, etc., must have been of enormous significance. But following on from Aknabrek and following sort of my realization that all those interesting things were happening at that sort of famous massive site, I also thought, well, it's important to explore some of the other rock art sites in the area, including Cairn Barn. And sure enough, I found that other sites too were positioned on rocks that displayed geological features. And in the right-hand picture here, you can see the sort of big lines, linear cracks extending across the outcrop. And those features also are broadly aligned on the winter sunset. And the other thing that I noticed, which is, I think, captured by both of these images, is how beautifully the carvings are lit by that low winter sun. And the sun is crossing the sky, seemingly in just the right place to light these carvings at the time of year when that light is such a rare thing. It's not there for long. So the fact that these rocks are gathering that light, I think, is of some significance. So I thought, let's explore further. This is Torbhlaren, or at least one of the outcrops at Torbhlaren, which is decorated with cup and ring markings. And look, it aligns. This is at sunset. The entire outcrop, again, rather like Aknabrek, aligns on the winter solstice sunset. And it not only aligns on the sun at that momentous time, but, and it's still difficult to see, but in this picture, in the bottom right-hand quarter, you might just make out some faint cups and rings. Now, other than these few days around midwinter, I have never ever seen those carvings with natural light, only with artificial light at nighttime with torches. So something very special is happening that reveals carvings that are impossible to see at other times of the year. Here's Ormaig. Now, Ormaig is interesting. it does a really good job of being illuminated in the summer months. It's not like rock art just disappears at other times of the year. And in the late afternoon in summer, you get really nice shadows which highlight these carvings. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Maybe Ormaig doesn't fit this pattern, this gathering pattern. And but I went there in midwinter, and to my surprise, because the hills around this site are quite tall, the sun appears in this notch, and there it is. And it beams through the landscape and it catches those carvings perfectly. It frames them. You can sort of see the shadows just beyond them, and they're lit with a vivid light that I just haven't seen at that site at other times of the year. Something very similar happens at Balua Craig, just as another example. So something interesting is happening there, but does that pattern sort of extend further? Well, one thing we could start to think about, in addition to observations in the landscape, is what the significance of these places may be in other ways. And one of the ways in which that's been tested is through excavation. And Torbhlaren and Ormaig have become very well known because of excavations between 2004 and 2009, revealing some quite unprecedented insights. In particularly, over 50 quartz hammerstones were found, and analysis suggests that these were actually being used to make the rock art motifs. It's a unique assemblage, and is now displayed in Kilmartin Museum. But given all of these things, the results of excavation at these sites, those observations in the landscape, the observations on the rocks themselves, etc., an important question remains. I've visited, and the sites that have been excavated are those which are probably some of the best known. They're also some of the most complex, some of the largest, some of the most extensively carved rocks in the area. And the question that I think was important to ask is, would any of these patterns extend to some of the more modest rock art sites in the area? So in 2023, Kilmartin Museum and Archaeology Scotland joined forces to explore that very question by excavating 3 cup and ring marked rocks on Carnassery Farm, which is at the very northern limit of Kilmartin Glen. And this work was funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund as part of the museum's recent redevelopment. Carnassery, just so you get an idea where it is these hills you can see on the horizon in the distance. This is the linear cemetery in the foreground. The museum would be just off to the right. And Carnassery Farm is essentially that raised skyline. As well as the research objectives, the project was designed to maximize opportunities for participation. So there were student placements, there was fieldwork training, a whole program of educational events that Jacqueline helped to mastermind, and over 100 school children were involved, and more than 40 volunteers helped us with the digging. So it's a fantastic project all around, really exciting. We already knew that Carnassery Farm was very significant. It's rich in archaeological sites, some of which are in this picture, or at least almost the extreme ends of the chronological spectrum are here, from that gigantic prehistoric cairn on the skyline to post-medieval settlements like that's in the foreground. And there are several rock art sites. And the ones that we investigated are in this area of the farm towards the southern limits of the land, of the boundary, and overlooking in the distance there, Kilmartin Glen. And they're situated close to a route which is now followed by the wall and the posts that are marching through the landscape in the photograph, which leads from the upper part of Kilmartin Glen, which is itself a kind of crossroads, over towards the Atlantic coastline. That's kind of interesting if you think back to when I was introducing the Glen and all those factors that might make it important. Routeways was one of them, and here we are, more rock art sites associated with routes through the landscape. All three sites that we investigated were being carved into meta-basalt bedrock, and all had also been recorded previously by Scotland's Rock Art Project. And I'm going to introduce each of those sites and go through a little bit of why the findings from them were significant. So this is what we call Site 1, and it's a fairly inconspicuous bedrock slab. It's almost flush to the turf line. So you just wouldn't see it if you weren't looking, if you didn't know where to go. But having said that, this low, subtle, flat outcrop displays the largest and most complex motif that's known at Conassery. This panel also has sort of similar views to the previous photograph. It looks out towards other monuments, including two funerary cairns, some standing stones, and that junction of routeways that I mentioned. There's also a waterfall nearby, which you can hear. And here's that site following excavation. Quite a modest trench, but it was enough to reveal the full extent of the carvings and a little bit more of the rock besides. And those recordings, those carvings were recorded using the 3D technology known as photogrammetry, producing this model which could then be lit digitally, so it really brings out the carvings, which were a little bit weathered. And you can kind of see that the motifs are framed to either side of what is effectively a diagonal crack across the surface of the rock. Now, really importantly, and this is absolutely fantastic, two quartz hammerstones were found directly alongside this rock art motif. They're the two at the top of this picture. And the third was found in another smaller trench just a few meters away. In addition, a single fragment of decorated prehistoric pottery was also found right alongside the decorated outcrop. Now, it hasn't been fully analysed yet, but it looks very much like that it dates to around the time when we think rock art was most likely being made, or at least the beginning of that time, possibly sort of towards the later end of the Neolithic. And it's one of the very few examples of pottery, prehistoric pottery, being found in association with a rock art site, an Atlantic art site, and a landscape site anywhere that I can think of. There's very few other instances of this happening. There are some other interesting observations, and these rather strange images are what happens when you take those photogrammetric models and you remove the natural texture and add a shiny one that brings out details on the rock a little bit more clearly to see. And this shows, if you look carefully, there's a sort of step this side of the carved imagery. And that step has a sort of series of scalloped edges. And those scalloped edges have not been created using metal tools. They're almost certainly artificial, but they weren't made using metal. And I think I saw Roger in the audience earlier, but Dr. Roger Anderton had a good look at this and looked at the weathering, looked at the shape of this formation. Yeah, it's not natural. It's been made by people, and it must be of considerable antiquity. And it's tempting to think that it might even go right the way back to the time when rock art was maybe being made or still visited in the Neolithic or the Bronze Age, because it's really interesting how the outcrop has been cut in a way which enhances the shape. of those carvings. I think, can you see what I mean? It sort of curves them round, and I've not seen that very often either. That's something pretty special. If we go back to a normal photograph of the rock, you can see that scalloped edge still, but you can see that it's part of a sort of a line of a sort of small scarp, and it looks like a considerable chunk of rock has actually been extracted. It's been taken away. It's just not there anymore. And I think we maybe need to do a little bit more work to absolutely be certain as to whether this is perhaps a prehistoric quarry, because that would be amazing, because we know that people quarried stone to make kists or to make standing stones, etc. And very intriguingly, a split stone was placed in the cavity left when that rock was extracted. So a possibly worked stone had been put back into the place where that rock had been extracted. That's site one. Amazing what happens when you just dig a small trench around a rock art site. Here's site two. Again, really subtle, really inconspicuous, but very different in character in so many ways to the previous example at site one. You can see we excavated two trenches, one around the carvings themselves, and the other in the foreground in a kind of hollow to one side of the main outcrop. I'll start with the one in the hollow in the foreground, because on those outcrops that were freshly revealed, we found, and I hope you can see these just below the scale, some previously unrecorded cup marks, always an exciting moment in an excavation. And also on the right-hand side, what's quite likely to be a late Neolithic retouched piece of flint. We also sampled, that's what's happening in this image, a deposit of charcoal. And subsequent analysis of this sampled charcoal suggested that this was a hearth where oak, hazel, and birch had been burnt. And they're very typical species of tree for the time that we're talking, for the late Neolithic or the early Bronze Age, or for the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. I say that because the charcoal could be radiocarbon dated, and the date was between 4000 and 4500 BC. That's quite early. That's very, almost certainly, I would say, predating when the carvings were made by several centuries. Talking of the carvings, here's the trench around the known carvings on this outcrop. The cut marks here are larger and shallower than others on the hillside nearby. The excavation revealed, oh, there we go. The excavation revealed small pieces of quartz, and also a few other additional bits of rock art, including, if you squint a bit, a ring around a cut mark in the very foreground of this slide. There were also other partial rings and a groove that we added to the existing record. And the freshly excavated, that freshly exposed surface emphasized how the carvings had been fitted, there we go, into what was a pre-existing pattern of linear parallel cracks that align, guess what, towards the winter sunset. The markings themselves, mostly cut marks with those other features, as partial rings and a faint ring that I mentioned earlier. Those markings in themselves, there we go, there's a more detailed view, are very much fitted into that pattern. And they're also distinctive, I think, in their own right. And partly because a lot of them are actually would have started out as natural features on the rock, which have been artificially hollowed and enhanced, which could explain why some of them have these slightly unusual elongated or ovoid shapes. They're not your classic circular cut marks in all instances. They're also very broad and very shallow and sort of dish-like. And that, in combination with only being single or partial rings, recalls the kinds of rock art that we find at some very, very different kinds of site in Kilmartin Glen. Here's one of them. And it's very interesting when we look at rock art in the Glen when it occurs on monumental structures, that it's very, very rarely complicated art. Yes, there's an example of spirals and more exotic, what we call megalithic art, which is most often associated with architecture. But cups and rings like this kind of belong as well to that Atlantic tradition of landscape-based rock art. And when Atlantic rock art, cups and rings, are found on standing stones, they are never complicated designs with those elaborate interconnected motifs with multiple rings. It's very, very distinctive that they are simple, big, broad, bold carvings with at most one ring around a cut mark, and cut marks are sometimes joined together to form dumbbells. And that's very much what we see on this stone that we were excavating at Carnassery. Another site where similar markings are found is Netherlargy North on the Kist lid, which is famous for the shallow carved images of flat axe heads, which are metal. But among those are a series of cut marks. And they're not just circular round cut marks, there are also ovals and more irregular shapes that you can see towards the right-hand side. They're large, they're bold, they're quite unusual. And I think this parallel between this outcrop on Carnassery and these monuments is intriguing. So could it suggest a chronological depth to the carvings at Carnassery? Maybe that complex art. Okay, this is going out there. This is making an educated guess, but that could quite easily be earlier than the monuments of the kind that I'm showing on screen now. But perhaps Site 2 at Carnassery could date more into the Bronze Age, when rock art, on monuments at least, seems to become simpler. This feature on Site 2 was really curious and had me scratching my head and asking lots of other people what they thought, because these two natural enhanced shapes, they've been pecked. You can see the sunlight is revealing the little peck marks where a hammerstone has been used to enhance these two features. These seem to form an intersection, and it results in a shape which is kind of reminiscent of a hafted artifact. And this isn't unique in the area, and that's what made me curious. And I asked lots of people, I dragged rock art people up onto the hillside and said, what do you think of this? And I said, oh yeah, that is quite interesting. I mean, we obviously we can't prove that this was intended in prehistory to resemble or made to resemble a hafted artifact. But isn't it curious that nearby are other sites with hafted artifacts? The Netherlargy Mid Kist has this subtle artifact with a hafted, which is hafted, and also the so-called halberd stone at Recruin. And this is a 3D replica that's on display in Kilmartin Museum. I just think the proximity of this panel with all of those distinctive features is significant and intriguing because it's so close to the very few monuments anywhere in Britain and Ireland that are adorned with both cut marks and depictions of artifacts. It's just a really interesting correlation, I think. And we need to just think about it some more. While we do that, the third and final site that we excavated was Site 3. This was slightly different to the others, and deliberately so. The others were those subtle low-lying panels that you almost wouldn't find if you didn't know where to locate them. Site 3 was rather more upstanding. It's more of a conspicuous outcrop in the landscape. On the top of this sort of rather in a quite precarious location at the top of this small cliff are a whole series of cut marks. And further back from the edge, just over the lip of the outcrop, is a more complex arrangement with close set cups and also a ring. We did open a trench up on the top of this outcrop, being very careful that no one was in any danger. And fragments of oak and birch charcoal were revealed, along with the fragments of a carbonized hazelnut shell. But no artifacts or additional carvings were found up on the top of the rock. So I'm going to skip over that trench and go to the second, which was located at the bottom of the scarped rock face. And this revealed this layer of close-set stones, which I briefly got very excited by until I realized that they were absolutely typical evidence of medieval or post-medieval quarrying. It's kind of like, oh, okay, that's a shame. The site's obviously been quarried. There's been disturbance since the rock art was created. We weren't surprised by this, but we thought, well, let's take away this debris from quarrying. Very angular flaked rocks, remove them. And we were glad we did, because we came down onto this beautiful, fresh surface of rock that really looked like it should have been carved with rock art, but it wasn't, and examined it very, very closely. But beneath those later stones, and in that V-shaped fissure, which also looked a little bit enhanced, a little bit opened up by stone tools, we found this lovely, glittery, sparkling fragment of quartz. There was a chunk and this split flake. And the lithics work that was done suggested that this lovely broken flake is actually a fragment of another hammerstone. But they were placed, and I used the word placed deliberately, within an angular crevice, and they were deep in that crevice, right down at the bottom. And I don't think it's an accident that they came to be there. I think that these pieces of quartz were deliberately placed. So I think, just to take pause, the Carnassery project, those 3 sites with those excavated trenches, revealed some absolutely fascinating insights and some really unexpected insights, allowing for some quite different kinds of interpretation. We got really lucky. Each of the 3 sites had what I could describe as complicated sort of biographies, if you like. They had their own life histories that extended right the way back, obviously, to the creation of the rock through glacial times, and right the way through, in some cases, to evidence for post-medieval activity. But what about the prehistoric interpretation? What about that comparison with those amazing assemblages that came from Torbhlaren and Ormaig during the fieldwork there all those years ago? Well, yeah, the density of worked quartz was relatively small in comparison to those sites. But then again, that could be an artifact of the way of where we located our trenches, of other disturbance to the site, etc. But at least we could demonstrate that these sites too had been made using quartz hammerstones. And I think that's what's really important as a takeaway. Quartz is a really interesting choice as a material. It's translucent, crystals sparkle when they catch the light. And under certain conditions, quartz emits that amazing, eerie, greenish glow known as triboluminescence. The example on the screen at the moment is from Torbhlaren, as the label says, and you can see that one side of the sun has been worked, possibly to shape cup and rings, so to sort of grooves, to create grooves and to form and smooth those markings. And like the finds, particularly from Torbhlaren over the hill in Kilmartin Glen, this discovery of quartz placed within fissures, I think, receives a wider context. In fact, there are parallels across Scotland, but I'm going to focus on Torbhlaren because it's so local. And again, you can see these three objects on display in Kilmartin Museum. It's a remarkable deposit that came from within a fissure on an outcrop at Torbhlaren, and in the middle is a hammerstone. It's been worked, been used to make rock art, and it was placed to be flanked by two other pieces of quartz, which have been deliberately split in half. So it's the two halves of a quartz block. And then that little group were placed together in this kind of arrangement back in a fissure and very likely buried. And I think that this hints at something of what we kind of know to be the special character of rock art sites. Something very individual is happening at these places. And it's not just about making the carvings themselves. There are other activities taking place there. Carnassua's outcrops, as I already alluded to, also mirror that northeast southwest axis of the landscape. And this was especially notable at site 2, with these parallel cracks in one direction aligning on the midwinter sunset. And that, of course, recalls all those examples right from the beginning of my talk this evening, where many of those larger rock art sites, and here we are back at Achnabreg, reproduce that same alignment. And this is the natural part of the stone, those cracks and fissures running across the surface of the rock, broadly parallel, broadly oriented in a northeast and southwest direction. And just like Achnabrig's largest and most unusual carvings, some of which are visible in this image, all of the panels at Carnassary, and I went and checked many, many times, are brilliantly lit in that low winter sun. None of them are placed in places where they could easily be in shadow with the sun being so low in the sky. And you can just make out a cut mark in the foreground being lit by that sun. And in fact, site 1, even though it's got this complicated motif that here is being lit by nice light, it's still quite subtle in the landscape. But it was discovered by the landowner after many years of walking past the location. Guess what? In wintertime, when the light was perfect for seeing it. And it's almost invisible at other times of the year. Of course, it's not just rock art that is aligned in this way or has this sort of association with sunrise or sunset, in particular with rock art at midwinter. The stone row at Ballymena is, well, references the dawn at midwinter, and the two stone circles at Temple Wood, the northern circle in the foreground, the southern circle behind with the standing stones just visible, take a line through the centers of these two circles, and they align on the midwinter sunset. But these are architecture, and in some ways, Achnabreg and these other rock art sites are rather different. Of course, they don't feature built architecture. And in some ways, you could say, well, they're not monuments in the conventional sense for that reason. They're doing something a bit different. And that's really the kind of the direction I'd like to look at now, is that they're not using built structures to emphasize the movements of the sun. They're actually drawing attention to a feature which is already present in the form of the rock itself. And they draw attention to it through the creation of carvings, therefore imbuing that outcrop with a special significance. And that special significance extends to prehistory, but in the present, if you like, it's a significance which changes how we think about, how archaeologists categorize a place. That if these markings were not on these rocks, they would just be natural places. So what rock art is doing is it's drawing our attention to what is a fortuitous relationship between geology and the movements of the sun. And this power that rock art has to kind of, I suppose, fuse together nature and culture is fascinating, at least it is to me, because it means that these markings, these symbols, are able to transform the significance and meaning of all of the places where these markings are being made. So we might focus on Achnabreg, and there we go, there's carvings in the foreground. Here's one of my montages of the sun crossing the sky. And Achnabreg might be Scotland's largest rock art site and spectacular, but it's actually a microcosm, if you like, an example of a broader pattern. It's almost provided a whole series of clues to how we could begin to see the landscape in a different kind of way that we can then take from this site where it's been very obviously done with these enormous carvings, with these elaborate designs, with this big dome of rock facing the setting sun. And we can take those ideas and extend them to other sites in the landscape. So this is just an example of a wider pattern. This is about Neolithic and Bronze Age people effectively transcending our division, our separation of nature and culture. By deploying markings here and elsewhere, they're transforming Kilmartin's entire landscape into a kind of monument in its own right. There's an example at Carnassery, to go from the largest site to one of the more modest, our site 3, a few cut marks on an outcrop on Carnassery Farm, but it's part of this distinctive linear feature crossing the image on screen from left to right. It's a kind of rib of rock. Guess what? That rib of rock is aligned to the southwest towards the winter sun. And it's marked in several places along its length by cut marks. If we look from a different perspective, Site 3 in the foreground on the left, across this shallow valley is another outcrop that runs parallel. There's a small rock shelter there, a cut mark with a ring around it. And together, if we explore this landscape, these ribs of rock, these ridges that are augmented with prehistoric carvings, delineate a kind of monumental route, like almost an avenue that's entirely geological in origin, but it aligns to the winter sun in one direction, and that's behind where I'm pointing the camera in this image, and in the other, it leads to that conspicuous mound on the skyline framed by those outcrops, where excavations by Kilmartin Museum in 2015 found a kist burial to have been inserted in the summit of that mound. So, where does this all leave us? Well, I began this evening by asking why Kilmartin Glen became such a special place in prehistory. And the best answer I can give is that there are a combination of reasons, of factors. And as I've already said, that extend from the practical, if you like, to the ceremonial. But while the monuments, the upstanding architecture are a focus us on very defined spaces and places, the inside of a stone circle, the stone row, the kist in a mound, rock art is quite different. Rock art reveals a fundamental cosmological significance that's inherent to the entire landscape. And that's another factor that I think we have to add to these ideas of why Kilmartin Glen is so special, because this is a remarkable thing. And while we might attempt to attach meanings to cup and ring markings, and I haven't even gone there by this evening, I haven't gone, what do these markings mean? What's this all about? Because when we attach a meaning to an abstract symbol like this, it's always going to be speculative. I've gone to a different, more fundamental level. I've just said, let's group together and just look at how this mark making is changing our experiences of the landscape. And if we look at that more fundamental level, then what is happening is that Kilmartin's enigmatic carvings are calling attention to this remarkable geological structure, which itself has a relationship with the movements of the sun at pivotal times of the year. In addition to that, the very contrasting visibility of these carvings through the seasons almost encourages us to look at them at certain times of the year when they're most clearly visible. And it's the winter when it's the best time to view them. And to have identified all of this, to have sort of, if you like, formulated, made these observations, it suggests that people in prehistory must have developed a very deep knowledge of this landscape over generations. And there we can bring the results of the Clanassery project back into play, because those radiocarbon dates from this lower trench at Site 2 support this idea. They reveal that people did indeed visit this location generations before the carvings were likely to have been made, and they made a fire. So from Achnabrek to Carnassery, Kilmartin's rock art is a remarkable legacy which continues to this day to reveal and to celebrate a spectacular and auspicious connection between people, the land, and the sky. And that is where I'm going to end this evening. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Erin. That was really, really interesting. And it's lovely to hear about the Carnassery rock art that you discovered, or and lots of other people that were volunteering on the dig discovered as well. So thank you for that, Erin.